Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Loch Dhu did not so much fall as it did loiter, a persistent, misty curtain that blurred the line between the grey waters of the sea loch and the heather-clad hills. PC Hamish Macbeth stood on the muddy bank of the river, his tall, lanky frame shrouded in a wax jacket that had seen better decades. His shock of fiery red hair was plastered to his forehead, and his hazel eyes were fixed with predatory intensity on a swirling eddy beneath a gnarled willow tree. In his hand was not a regulation police baton, but a sturdy fishing rod. To Hamish, the laws of the land were occasionally flexible, especially when the law in question involved a plump, silver-scaled Atlantic salmon that had no business being in the river during the closed season. "Steady now, lugs," Hamish whispered to the mangy, oversized mongrel sitting patiently at his heels. The dog's ears, one perpetually cocked and the other flopping over his eye, twitching in agreement. Hamish was a man who moved with a deceptive, slow-motion grace. To the hurried tourists who occasionally blundered into Sutherland, he looked like a shiftless local who had found a uniform in a charity shop. This was an image Hamish cultivated with the care a gardener might give to a prized orchid. If the authorities in Strathbane thought him lazy, they wouldn't promote him. If they didn't promote him, they wouldn't transfer him to the grim, soot-stained streets of a city where the air tasted of exhaust fumes instead of peat smoke and salt spray. The salmon leaped, a flash of pure muscle against the dull sky, and Hamish's line hummed. Just as he began the delicate dance of reeling it in, a shrill, rhythmic trilling pierced the Highlands silence. It was the mobile phone in his pocket, a device he loathed nearly as much as he loathed paperwork. He ignored it. The fish was more important than whatever bureaucratic nonsense DCI Blair was likely screaming about. But then, the sound of a high-performance engine, entirely out of place in a village where most vehicles were held together by rust and prayer, echoed off the surrounding crags. A silver Jaguar, sleek and predatory, screeched to a halt near the old stone bridge. Out stepped a man who looked as though he had been curated by an expensive London tailor specifically to annoy the locals. He wore a crisp, cream-coloured trench coat, Italian leather shoes that were already being ruined by the Sutherland muck, and an expression of profound condescension. This was Julian Vane, the newcomer who had recently purchased the old manse and proceeded to alienate every soul in Loch Dhu within 48 hours of his arrival. Vane cupped his hands around his mouth. Officer, I know you're down there. I can see your ridiculous hat." Hamish sighed. The salmon seized the moment of distraction to snap the line, disappearing back into the depths with a flick of its tail. Hamish stared at the empty water for a long moment, then slowly turned, his face settling into a mask of polite, vacant stupidity. "Aye, Mr. Vane, is there a fire?" Hamish called back, his voice thick with a Highland lilt that he deepened whenever he wanted to sound particularly gormless. "There is a nuisance," Vane shouted, picking his way toward the bank with the gingerly steps of a cat in a bathtub. "The Parish Hall, the Winter Fair Committee meeting. It's a shambles. Mrs. Kennedy is refusing to move the jam display, and that dreadful man who smells of sheep is threatening to bring his accordions. I demand you come and restore order. As the representative of the law, you are required to ensure the peace is kept." Hamish climbed the bank, lugs trailing behind him. "The Parish Hall, is it? Well now, that's a very serious matter, Mr. Vane. A jam dispute can turn ugly fast in these parts. I once saw a woman lose a tooth over a jar of marmalade in '92. Vane sneered, his lip curling. "Don't be droll, Macbeth. It's beneath you, or perhaps it's exactly at your level. You people are so hopelessly stuck in the past. I'm trying to bring a touch of class to this damp little outpost, and I'm met with nothing but pig-headedness." "Class is a fine thing," Hamish said mildly, wiping his muddy hands on his trousers. "But Loch Dhu has its own way of doing things. It's like the weather. You can't really change it. You just have to find a good coat." "I don't pay my taxes to listen to folk philosophy," Vane snapped. He checked his gold watch. "The meeting reconvenes in 20 minutes. I expect you to be there to ensure my proposal for the black tie gala is passed without further interference from the local peasantry." Vane turned on his heel and marched back to his Jaguar, the engine roaring as he sped off toward the village square. Hamish watched the exhaust fumes dissipate. He felt a familiar creeping sense of dread. It wasn't just the loss of the salmon, it was the atmosphere in the village. Since Vane had arrived, the air felt brittle. The man was a bore in the truest, most dangerous sense of the word, a man so convinced of his own importance that he failed to notice the sharpening of knives around him. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, patting the dog's head, "I suppose we should go and see about this jam, though I've a feeling Mr. Vane is going to find that the people of Loch have a very low tolerance for being told how to eat their scones." He began the long walk back to the police station, taking the scenic route past the Loch Hotel. He needed a coffee, strong, black, and preferably free. He stopped by the kitchen entrance, where Mrs. Curry, the proprietor, was shaking out a rug. "He's at it again, Hamish," she grumbled, her face like a crumpled map of the Great Glen. "That Vane fellow came in here this morning complaining that the kippers weren't organic. I told him they were caught in the loch right out front, and he asked if the loch had been certified. The man's a menace." "He's got the parish hall in a stir," Hamish noted, leaning against the doorframe. "He'll get more than a stir if he keeps talking to the minister's wife the way he did yesterday, called her flower arrangements quaintly funereal. I'm telling you, Hamish, someone's going to do that man a mischief, and I won't be the one to provide an alibi." Hamish took his coffee and sat on a bench overlooking the water, the mist settling deeper into his bones. He watched the village clock tower, his hands creeping toward the hour. He knew he should go. He knew the peace of Loch was a fragile thing, easily shattered by an outsider with a loud voice and a silver car. But for now, he simply sat, listening to the silence of the Highlands and the distant rhythmic ticking of a storm that was brewing in more ways than one. He had a feeling that by nightfall, the jam dispute would be the least of his worries, and the quiet life he fought so hard to protect was about to be interrupted by something far more permanent than a lost salmon. The coffee was bitter and lukewarm, but it served its purpose as Hamish watched the villagers begin to drift toward the parish hall, their heads bowed against the drizzle like a flock of disgruntled ravens. He set the empty cup aside and whistled low for Lugs. It was time to fulfill his duties, however much he wished he were back by the peat fire in his kitchen with a poaching wire and a quiet conscience. The village of Loch usually operated on a system of mutual silences and long-standing grudges that rarely required police intervention, but Julian Vane was a catalyst of a different sort. He was the kind of man who viewed a quiet Highland village as a blank canvas for his own ego, and the locals, Hamish knew, were more of a rugged granite than a canvas. As he approached the parish hall, the sound of raised voices spilled out into the damp afternoon air. The hall was a draughty Victorian structure that smelled of floor wax, damp wool, and the faint, lingering aroma of generations of church socials. Hamish stepped through the heavy oak doors, Lugs trotting at his side with an air of professional boredom. The interior was a chaotic tableau of village life. Mrs. Kennedy was indeed guarding a trestle table laden with jam jars as if it were a strategic hill in a border war, while Archie McLean, the local shepherd who habitually smelled of wet fleece and fermented malt, was gesticulating wildly with an accordion case. At the centre of the fray stood Julian Vane. He had removed his cream trench coat to reveal a charcoal cashmere sweater that cost more than Hamish earned in a quarter. He was holding a clipboard and looking at the ceiling with the pained expression of a martyr. "It is quite simple," Vane was saying, his voice cutting through the local accents like a shard of glass. "The Highland theme is tired. It's kitsch. It's embarrassing. We shall replace the tombola with a silent auction for vintage wines, and the accordion music, which is frankly an assault on the auditory nerves, will be replaced by a string quartet I've scouted from Edinburgh." "Assault?" Archie McLean roared. his face turning a shade of purple that matched his favourite waistcoat. "I've played the rowan tree for every winter fair since you were in short trousers, you English puffin. And that," Vane replied coolly, "is precisely the problem. Progress, Archie, requires removing the obsolete. Now, PC Macbeth, thank goodness you're here. Tell these people that the parish hall is public property and that as the newly appointed, albeit self-appointed, cultural coordinator, my directives carry the weight of civic improvement." Hamish hooked his thumbs into his belt, leaning back against the door frame. He looked at the angry faces of his neighbours and then at the shimmering arrogance of Julian Vane. "Well now," Hamish began, his voice slow and soothing. "Civic improvement is a grand phrase, Mr. Vane, but in Lochdu we find that if you try to pull up the old heather to plant roses, the Highland wind usually just kills the roses and leaves you with bare dirt. Mrs. Kennedy's jam is a staple. If you take away the raspberry preserve, you'll have a riot on your hands that a whole battalion of string quartets couldn't soothe." Mrs. Kennedy nodded vigorously, her hatpins quivering. Vane looked at Hamish with pure, unadulterated contempt. "I should have known. You're all in league. A conspiracy of mediocrity, fine. Have your little jam and accordion nightmare, but don't come crying to me when the tourists stay in Inverness because this place looks like a museum of bad taste." Vane snatched his coat from a chair and marched toward the small kitchen annex at the back of the hall. "I need tea," he barked over his shoulder, "and God help the person who brings me powdered milk." The heavy door to the annex slammed shut. The villagers stood in stunned silence for a moment before a low murmur of resentment began to swell. Hamish stayed where he was, his eyes narrowing. He watched the closed door of the kitchen. There was something about the way Vane had retreated, a frantic edge to his arrogance, that suggested he wasn't just annoyed, he was rattled. Perhaps Lochdu was proving harder to conquer than his previous boardrooms. "He's a nasty bit of work, Hamish," Archie muttered, huffing as he retreated to a corner to inspect his accordion. "Acting like he owns the air we breathe. Someone ought to tell him that the manse might be his, but the soul of this village doesn't come with a deed." "Aye," Hamish said absently. He noticed Mrs. Kennedy's daughter, Mary, slipping out of the back of the hall, her face pale. She had been working as a temporary housekeeper for Vane, and the gossip in the village was that Vane's standards were frequently delivered with a side of verbal abuse. 20 minutes passed. The meeting didn't so much reconvene as it did devolve into smaller pockets of bitter whispering. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive, mirroring the storm that had finally decided to break outside. Thunder rolled over the loch, rattling the tall leaded windows of the hall. "Should he be taking this long for a cup of tea?" Mrs. Kennedy asked, glancing toward the kitchen. "The kettle hasn't even whistled. It's an electric one, mind, but it makes a fair old hum." Hamish felt a prickle of unease at the base of his neck. Luggs, who had been dozing near the radiator, suddenly stood up and let out a low, mournful whimper. The dog's gaze was fixed on the kitchen door. "I'll go check on him," Hamish said, his voice losing its lazy lilt. He walked across the hollow wooden floorboards, the sound of his boots echoing in the sudden silence of the room. He reached for the handle of the kitchen door. It was cold to the touch. He pushed it open slowly, half expecting to see Vane standing there with a look of fury, ready to complain about the quality of the china. Instead, the kitchen was silent, save for the frantic, dry clicking of the electric kettle which had boiled dry and was now straining against its own heating element. The room was dim, lit only by the flashes of lightning from the window. Julian Vane was there, but he wasn't making tea. He was slumped across the heavy pine table, his face buried in a large, overturned bowl of what looked like Mrs. Kennedy's prize-winning lemon curd. One hand was draped over the edge of the table, his gold watch glinting in the strobe-like light of the storm. Hamish moved forward, his movements practiced and grim. He placed 2 fingers against Vane's neck. There was no pulse. The man was cold. Not with the chill of the Highlands, but with the final, absolute stillness of death. Hamish looked around the small room, his keen eyes taking in every detail, the way the back door was slightly ajar, letting in a spray of rain, the single teacup smashed on the floor, and the strange, sickly sweet smell that sat beneath the scent of the lemon curd. Julian Vane, the man who had found everyone in Loch Dhu beneath him, had finally met his end in a bowl of Parish jam, and Hamish's quiet day was now officially a crime scene. Hamish stood perfectly still in the dim light of the kitchen annex, the dry clicking of the overheated kettle serving as a rhythmic mechanical pulse in the otherwise hollow silence of the room. Outside the door he could hear the restless shuffling of the villagers, their murmurs growing louder as curiosity began to overcome their collective resentment. He knew that the moment he stepped back into that hall and announced what had happened, the fragile peace of Loch Dhu would be shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He took a long, steady breath, the scent of the lemon curd cloying and thick in the air, and began to observe the scene with the sharp, predatory focus he usually reserved for a prize salmon in a forbidden pool. Vane's body was positioned awkwardly, almost comically, had the circumstances been less dire. The way his head was submerged in the thick yellow preserve suggested a sudden, violent collapse. Hamish noted that there was no sign of a struggle, no blood on the linoleum, no bruising visible on the pale neck above the cashmere collar. His eyes drifted to the smashed teacup on the floor. It hadn't just fallen, it looked as though it had been dropped in a moment of absolute paralysis. A small, dark puddle of tea was spreading toward the slightly ajar back door, where the Highland wind continued to whistle through the gap, bringing with it the scent of wet earth and impending winter. "Nobody moves!" "Stay exactly where you are," Hamish shouted, raising his voice to a tone of authority that rarely appeared in his daily life. He stepped back into the doorway of the annex, blocking the view of the interior from the prying eyes of the committee. The hall went silent. Mrs. Kennedy's hand stopped mid-air near a jar of strawberry jam, and Archie McLean froze with his accordion half extended, creating a long, wheezing groan from the bellows. "What is it, Hamish?" Archie asked, his voice trembling. "Is the man having a fit of the vapours? Too much excitement for his London heart?" "Mr. Vane is dead," Hamish said flatly. He watched the room's reaction warily. There was a collective gasp, followed by a silence so profound you could hear the rain lashing against the roof tiles. He looked for a flicker of guilt, a panicked glance, or an overly dramatic display of grief. Instead, he saw a range of expressions from stunned disbelief to something that looked suspiciously like relief. "Dead?" Mrs. Kennedy whispered, her face turning the colour of unbaked dough. But he was just complaining about the tea. He was Julian Vane. "People like that don't just die in kitchens. They do today," Hamish replied. He pointed toward the heavy oak doors. "I want everyone to move into the main body of the hall. Don't touch anything. Not a spoon, not a doily, and certainly not that back kitchen door. I have to make a call." He reached into his pocket and dialed the number for the Strathbane station. He knew exactly what was coming. A death in the village, especially one involving a wealthy Englishman with a silver Jaguar and a foul temper, would bring the heavy-handed machinery of the Highland police down upon them like a landslide. Specifically, it would bring DCI Blair. "Loch Dhu Parish Hall," Hamish said to the receiver once the duty sergeant answered. "We have a fatality. It's Julian Vane from Old Manse. The one who's been making the complaints." "Suspicious circumstances?" "Well, unless he had a fatal allergy to lemon curd delivered at the speed of light, I'd say it's very suspicious indeed." As he waited for the inevitable arrival of the cavalry, Hamish sat on a wooden chair near the kitchen entrance, lugs resting his heavy head on Hamish's boot. He didn't look like a detective. He looked like a man who was deeply annoyed that his afternoon had been ruined, but behind his hooded eyes he was already cataloguing villagers. He saw Mary Kennedy standing near the back, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. She looked more terrified than surprised. He saw the minister, Mr. Wellington, looking down at his shoes with a sombre, perhaps overly rehearsed, expression of piety. The wait wasn't long. The distance from Strathbane was usually a 40-minute drive, but DCI Blair, fueled by a permanent sense of outrage and a desire for a high-profile collar, managed it in 30. The screech of sirens tore through the village, followed by the heavy thud of car doors and the unmistakable bark of a man who believed the world was a personal insult directed specifically at him. The doors of the parish hall burst open, and DCI Blair stormed in, followed by his two shadows, Detectives Anderson and McLean. Blair was a squat, red-faced man with a neck that seemed to be in a constant battle with his shirt collar. He looked around the room with a sneer of pure professional loathing. "Where is he?" Blair demanded, ignoring the gathered villagers and marching straight for Hamish. "Where's the body, Macbeth? And don't tell me you've let the locals trample over the evidence while you were off having a nap." "The body is in the annex, sir," Hamish said, standing up slowly and making sure to look as dishevelled as possible. He knocked his hat slightly askew for good measure. "I've kept the room sealed since I found him. Nobody's been in but Luggs and myself, and Luggs has very clean paws." Blair pushed past him, nearly knocking Archie McLean over in the process. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at the slumped form of Julian Vane. "Lemon curd?" Blair barked, a harsh grating laugh escaping him. "The man drowned in a bowl of yellow slop. You're telling me this is a murder and not just a case of spectacular clumsiness?" "The kettle boiled dry, sir," Hamish pointed out mildly, stepping up behind him, "and the back door was open. Mr. Vane was very particular about his tea. He wouldn't have let the kettle burn out while he was busy eating curd with his face. It looks like he collapsed instantly. Toxic, I'd wager." "You'd wager, would you?" Blair turned on him, his face a deepening shade of crimson. "Listen to me, Macbeth. You're a village bobby. You're here to catch bicycle thieves and tell the tourists where the toilets are. You leave the wagering to the real police. It's obvious what happened here. The man had a heart attack, fell forward, and the door blew open in the wind. The case closed before paperwork began." "But the smell, sir," Hamish started. "The only thing that smells here is your incompetence," Blair roared. "Anderson, McLean, get the crime scene tape up. Get these peasants out of here. I want the old manse searched, and I want a list of everyone who was in this hall. If I find out this Vane fellow was pushed, I'll have a lot of them in the cells by morning. But for now, Macbeth, you can mooch off to the station and stay out of my way before I have you transferred to the traffic division in Glasgow." Hamish nodded obediently, his face a mask of humble submission. But as he turned away, his eyes caught a single tiny detail Blair had missed in his rush to be right. A small, dried smear of something purple on the edge of the white porcelain sink far away from the lemon curd and the broken tea. It was a smudge of jam, and Hamish knew for a fact that Mrs. Kennedy's prize-winning raspberry was the only thing in the hall that matched that exact dark hue. The investigation had begun, and as usual, the formal police were looking at the mountain while Hamish was looking at the pebbles. Hamish accepted his dismissal with a well-practiced slump of the shoulders, looking for all the world like a man whose only remaining ambition was to find a dry patch of grass and a long nap. He whistled for Luggs, who gave a sceptical look toward DCI Blair's shiny brogues before trotting toward the exit. Behind them, the parish hall was becoming a hive of aggressive, misplaced activity. Blair was shouting orders about fingerprint dust and floor plans, his voice bouncing off the high rafters and sending the remaining villagers scurrying toward the rain-slicked streets of Loch Dhu. Hamish didn't head back to the police station. Instead, he took the long way round, cutting through the narrow alley behind the grocery shop. He knew that in a village like this, the truth wasn't found in a laboratory in Strathbane, but in the steam rising from a teapot and the subtle pauses in a neighbour's gossip. He made his first stop at the back door of the Loch Dhu Italian takeaway, where the owner, Patel, was leaning against a stack of flour sacks, watching the flashing blue lights in the distance. Patel was a man of many secrets, and even more spices, and his vantage point near the hall gave him a panoramic view of the village's back-channel movements. "Terrible business, Hamish," Patel said, not moving an inch as the tall policeman approached. "A man dies in a bowl of curd. It is not a very dignified way for a gentleman of the Jaguar class to depart, is it? My curry would have been a more honourable end." "Aye, it's a messy business, Patel," Hamish replied, leaning against the cold stone wall and looking up at the grey sky. "Did you see much of the gentleman before he went into the hall? He seemed in a mighty hurry to get there." Patel scratched his chin thoughtfully. He was pacing the square for 20 minutes before the meeting, talking on that little silver phone of his. He didn't look like a man coming to discuss a winter fair. He looked like a man waiting for a payoff. And Mary Kennedy? She was with him for a moment. They were arguing near the bins. She looked as though she'd seen a ghost, or perhaps just a very large bill she couldn't pay. Hamish hid this information. Mary Kennedy was a sweet girl, but she was fragile, and Vane was the sort of predator who enjoyed breaking fragile things. And the back door of the hall, Patel. Did you see anyone using it while the meeting was in full swing? Only the wind, Hamish, and perhaps a shadow or two. It's a busy day for the shadows in Loch Dhu. Hamish thanked him and moved on, his boots squelching in the mud. He headed toward the post office, the nerve centre of the village's information network. Mrs. Emma Jane, the postmistress, was already holding court behind the counter, her eyes bright with the reflected light of a dozen unfolding scandals. She had a pot of tea brewing on a small electric ring, and the smell of toasted tea cakes filled the cramped space. "Hamish Macbeth, come in before you drown," she chirped, already reaching for a spare mug. "I hear Blair is back. Horrid man," he shouted at the minister, cat on his way in. "Now tell me, is it true Julian Vane was poisoned by a rival in the antique trade, or was it a jealous lover from London?" Hamish sat on a stool, letting the warmth of the shop seep into his bones. "Now, Emma Jane, you know I can't be talking about an ongoing investigation. Blair would have my head on a pike. But I did notice a very strange thing. Mrs. Kennedy's raspberry jam. It seemed to be in places it shouldn't be. In the kitchen sink, far from the tables." Emma Jane paused, her tea strainer hovering over the mug. "Raspberry? That's odd. Mrs. Kennedy told me only this morning that she'd lost a jar. She thought Archie McLean's dog had made off with it, or perhaps one of the school children. She was quite put out. She only makes 12 jars of that special batch, the one with the hint of cloves and the wild berries from the high slope." Hamish took a slow sip of the tea. Cloves. That explained the spicy medicinal undercurrent he had caught beneath the scent of the lemon curd. If someone had spiked a jar of jam and substituted it, or used it as a delivery system for something more lethal, they would have needed access to the hall or Vane's house. He thought of the small smear of purple on the sink. Someone had been washing their hands in a hurry. "Mr. Vane was a man with many enemies, wouldn't you say?" Hamish asked, his voice casual. "Enemies?" Emma Jane snorted. "The man was a walking grievance. He'd sued the church over the bell ringing. He'd threatened to block the right-of-way through the manse woods, and he was holding some sort of dark cloud over poor Mary Kennedy's head. Something about missing silver from the manse. He told her he'd call the police, the real police in Strathbane, mind you, if she didn't compensate him. The girl's been a nervous wreck." Hamish felt a surge of cold anger. Vane hadn't just been a bore, he had been a bully. But in the Highlands, bullies often found the calmest people had the longest memories. He thought of DCI Blair currently stomping around the parish hall, looking for high-level conspiracies and London hitmen, while the answer was likely sitting in a kitchen cupboard or a local's heart. "I think I'll take a walk up toward the old manse," Hamish said, standing up and adjusting his belt, "just to see if the windows are shut. With this wind, you wouldn't want the curtains getting ruined." "You be careful, Hamish," Emma Jane warned, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A man like Vane doesn't leave a vacuum when he dies. He leaves a mess, and some messes are toxic if you get too close." Hamish nodded, stepped out into the rain, and began the steep climb toward the old manse. He wasn't looking for curtains. He was thinking about Mary Kennedy, the missing jar of jam, and the fact that in Loch Dhu even the sweetest things could be used to kill if you had enough reason to want someone gone. As he walked, he saw Elspeth Grant's Land Rover splashing through the puddles toward the hotel. He'd need to talk to her soon. Elspeth had a way of seeing the things Hamish missed, especially when it came to the hidden cruelties of the upper class. But first, he had to see where Julian Vane had lived, and more importantly, what he had been hiding in that silver-tongued shadow of his. The climb to the old manse was a steady, lung-burning trek that took Hamish away from the huddled chimneys of the village and up into the raw, bracing air of the ridge. The rain had settled into a fine, soaking hair that clung to the gorse like spider silk. The manse itself was an imposing grey stone structure that sat atop the hill with an air of unearned superiority, much like its late owner. It was surrounded by a dense stand of pines that groaned in the wind, their needles creating a slippery, acidic carpet underfoot. Hamish paused at the gate, his hand resting on the cold iron latch. He wasn't surprised to find that the silver Jaguar was missing from the drive. Blair had likely ordered it impounded, or perhaps one of his detectives was currently driving it back to Strathbane with the heater on full blast. Luggs gave a low, uncertain growl, his hackles rising. The house felt wrong. Even from the outside it radiated a sense of coldness that had nothing to do with the lack of a fire in the hearth. Hamish stepped onto the gravel path, his eyes scanning the windows. He noticed that the heavy velvet curtains in what must have been the study were pulled tight, but a single, thin sliver of light was visible at the edge. Someone was inside, and given the speed with which Blair's team had been dispatched to the parish hall, it wasn't likely to be the official police. Before he could reach the front door, the low rumble of a Land Rover echoed up the drive. Hamish turned to see Elspeth Grant's battered green vehicle splashing through the puddles. It groaned to a halt, and Elspeth climbed out, looking as sensible and sturdy as the landscape itself in her thick tweed trousers and a Barber jacket that actually smelled of the outdoors. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and her expression was one of guarded concern. "Hamish," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the wind, "I heard the news at the hotel. The whole village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. They're saying Vane dropped dead right in the middle of a row over the winter gala." "Aye, Elspeth, he did indeed," Hamish said, moving to meet her. "Died with his face in a bowl of lemon curd. Blair's convinced it's a heart attack, but I've got my doubts. There was a smell in that kitchen that didn't belong to a bake sale." Elspeth sighed, looking up at the grim facade of the manse. Julian Vane wasn't a man designed for longevity in a place like this. He treated Lochdu like a hobby, and the people in it like accessories. "I was coming up here to check on Mary Kennedy. She called me an hour ago, sounding hysterical. She said Vane had found something out, something about her brother." "Her brother, young Tommy?" Hamish asked, his ears pricking. Tommy Kennedy was a lad with a penchant for fast motorbikes and a slow moral compass, but he wasn't a killer. Vane claimed Tommy had broken into the manse last week and made off with a collection of antique snuff boxes. He was threatening to press charges unless Mary made it right. He was blackmailing her, Hamish, using her fear of the law to force her into working for nothing or worse. Hamish felt the anger he'd been nursing since the parish hall solidified into a cold, hard knot. Blackmail was a dirty business, and Vane had been playing it with the casual cruelty of a man who thought himself untouchable. Did she say if she'd been up here today? She wouldn't say. She just kept crying about the sweetness of it, Elspeth replied, her brow furrowed. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but if Vane died in a bowl of lemon curd, the sweetness, Hamish repeated. He looked back at the house. "I think we should go inside, Elspeth, carefully. I saw a light in the study." They moved toward the front door. Hamish didn't reach for his keys. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed it open, the hinges giving a long, mournful creak that was swallowed by the wind. The entrance hall was a testament to Vane's obsession with a past that wasn't his. It was filled with heavy, dark furniture, portraits of stern-faced ancestors who weren't related to him, and an oppressive silence that tasted of dust. Hamish led the way toward the study, his boots making no sound on the thick Persian rugs. He reached the door and pushed it open a fraction. The room was bathed in the dim glow of a single desk lamp. Sitting in Vane's high-backed leather chair was Mary Kennedy. She wasn't searching for money or silver. She was sitting perfectly, still, staring at an open ledger on the desk. In front of her sat a small, empty glass jar. It was the missing raspberry jam jar Mrs. Emma Jane had mentioned. "Mary?" Hamish said softly, entering the room. The girl jumped, a sharp cry escaping her. She looked at Hamish and Elspeth with eyes that were wide and bloodshot. "I didn't mean it, P.C. Macbeth. I truly didn't. I just wanted him to sleep. I just wanted him to stop talking about Tommy and the jail." "To sleep?" Hamish asked, his voice low and steady. He walked to the desk and picked up the jar. He sniffed the rim. Beneath the faint scent of wild raspberries and cloves, there was something else. The bitter, almond-like tang of crushed foxglove seeds, digitalis. In small doses, it was a medicine. In large doses, it was a death sentence that mimicked a massive cardiac event. "He was so loud," Mary sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Always shouting, always demanding. I put it in his tea this morning, just a little, to make him groggy so I could find the ledger and the papers he had on Tommy. But he did not drink tea. He said it was cold and foul. He took a spoonful of the curd instead, and he just went down." Elspeth moved to the girl's side, putting a comforting arm around her. Hamish, however, was looking at the ledger. He flipped through the pages. It wasn't just Mary and Tommy. Vane had been keeping records on half the village. Petty secrets, old debts, minor indiscretions. The man had been a professional moocher of a different kind, a collector of human weakness. "Mary, did anyone else see you with that jar today?" Hamish asked, his eyes never leaving the ledger. "Only Mr. Wellington," she whispered. "The minister. He saw me in the church garden this morning. He asked what I was doing with the berries. I told him I was making a gift." Hamish froze. The minister. Mr. Wellington was a man who preached about forgiveness but lived in a manse that was falling apart for lack of funds. He looked at the ledger again. There was a name at the bottom of the last page, written in Vane's cramped, arrogant hand, Wellington. The Building Fund, 1994. A shadow moved in the doorway behind them. Hamish didn't turn around. He could smell the faint holy scent of incense and old paper. "It's a terrible thing, Hamish," a soft, cultivated voice said from the darkness of the hall, "when the sweetness of life turns to ash in the mouth." Hamish realized then that Mary's confession, as heartfelt as it was, might only be half the truth, and the shadow in the doorway held the other, far darker half. Hamish did not move a muscle, but he felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle as the scent of the manse's damp rot mingled with the sudden sharp aroma of old pipe tobacco and peppermint, the unmistakable olfactory signature of the Reverend Mr. Wellington. Beside him, Mary Kennedy let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Elspeth remained steady, though her eyes flickered toward the shadows in the doorway with the keen, judgmental sharpness of a Highland hawk. "Step into the light, Mr. Wellington," Hamish said, his voice dropping the playful lilt of the village simpleton. It was now the voice of the law, cold and as unyielding as the granite beneath the loch. It's a powerful late hour for a pastoral visit, especially when the flock is in such a state of disarray. The minister stepped into the amber glow of the desk lamp. He looked every inch the pillar of the community, dressed in his sombre blacks with a clerical collar that seemed to be the only thing holding his weary, sagging face upright. He looked down at the ledger on the desk, then at the empty jar of raspberry jam in Hamish's hand. There was no flicker of fear in his eyes, only a profound, exhausted sadness that reached deep into the marrow of his bones. "I saw Mary in the garden, yes," Wellington said softly, his voice echoing in the wood-panelled room. "I saw the girl's desperation. It is a terrible thing, Hamish, to watch a predator systematically dismantle a soul for the sake of a few silver trinkets and a sense of power. Julian Vane did not understand the nature of this place. He thought the Highlands were a stage, and we were merely the extras in his grand performance. He didn't realize that in Lochdu we are a family, and families protect their own, even if the cost is their immortal soul." "Is that what you were doing, Minister?" Hamish asked, stepping around the desk, his shadow stretching long and thin across the Persian rug. Protecting the family? Or were you protecting the building fund of 1994? The minister flinched as if Hamish had struck him. He looked at the ledger where Vane's accusations regarding the mismanaged church funds were laid bare in ink that seemed to pulse with malice. The roof was leaking, Hamish. The rain was destroying the pews. I didn't take a penny for myself. I merely redirected certain legacies. Vane found out. He threatened to go to the presbytery. He wanted to see me disgraced, evicted, and the church sold off to be turned into a boutique, hotel, or some other Londoner's folly. Elspeth rose, her face pale. So you knew Mary was planning something. You saw her with the foxglove. I saw her gathering the plants, Wellington admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I saw her trembling hands, and when she brought that jar of jam to the hall today, I knew what she intended. I could have stopped her. I could have taken the jar, but instead I watched. I watched her put it on the table. I even moved the lemon curd closer to it, knowing Julian's penchant for the sour and the sweet combined. I didn't pull the trigger, Hamish, but I certainly loaded the gun and pointed it. Mary began to sob in earnest now, a low, keening sound that filled the room with a raw, jagged grief. I didn't think he'd die. I just wished he was sick, to go away. Hamish looked from broken girl to weary minister. The complexity of the human heart was often more treacherous than the mist on the choir ring. DCI Blair was likely still at the parish hall, screaming at Anderson about forensic swabs and fingerprint patterns, entirely oblivious to the fact that the murder of Julian Vane had been a collaborative effort of silence and neglect. You moved the curd, Hamish said, his eyes narrowing. That's why there was a smear of raspberry in the sink. You weren't washing your hands of the crime minister, you were washing the evidence off a spoon. You saw him fall, didn't you? I saw him gasp, Wellington said, a single tear tracking through the deep lines of his face. I saw him clutch his chest. He looked at me, Hamish. He looked at me with a sudden terrifying clarity. He knew, and I just stood there and watched life leave him while the kettle hummed. I thought of the church roof. I thought of the peace of the village, and I felt nothing but relief. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of things that could never be unsaid. Hamish looked at the empty jar. He knew that if he took this to Blair now, Mary would be destroyed, and the village would lose its spiritual centre. Blair wouldn't care about the nuance of blackmail or the desperation of a leaking roof. He would see a high-profile conviction, a chance for a promotion, and a way to humiliate Hamish Macbeth one last time. "Give me the ledger, Mary," Hamish said suddenly. His voice was no longer cold, it was weary. The girl looked up, blinking through her tears. Hamish reached out and took the book from her shaking hands. He looked at the entries, the secrets of Lochdu, the petty shames and the hidden debts. Without a word, he walked to the cold fireplace. He took a box of matches from the mantelpiece, struck one, and held it to the corner of the paper. The dry vellum caught instantly, the flames licking hungrily at the names of his neighbours. "Hamish!" Elspeth hissed, her eyes wide. "That's evidence." "It's poison, Elspeth," Hamish replied, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the burning book. Vane was dead long before the foxglove touched his lips. He was dead to this community the moment he decided to use people's lives as currency. I won't have the rest of the village dragged down into the muck because of a man who didn't know how to be a neighbour. He watched until the ledger was nothing but a pile of black curling ash. Then he turned to the minister. "You'll be making a very large anonymous donation to the Kennedy family, Mr. Wellington. And you'll find a way to fix that roof without stealing from the dead. As for Mary, she's going home and staying there. If I hear so much as a whisper of foxglove in this parish again, I'll be back with a pair of handcuffs that won't care about your brother or your church." "But Blair," Wellington stammered. "He'll find something. He's a bulldog." "Blair is looking for a mastermind," Hamish said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He's looking for a professional hitman or a London rival. He'll never believe that a man like Julian Vane could be brought down by a jar of jam and a minister's silence. I'll give him what he wants, a lead that goes nowhere and a reason to leave Lochdu in a huff. As they left the old manse, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the air smelling of pine and wet earth. Hamish walked down the drive, lugs at his side, feeling the immense weight of the secret he now carried. He had protected the village, but in doing so, he had become a part of its shadows. He looked out over the loch, where the first hint of moonlight was breaking through the clouds. The mystery was far from over. He still had to lead Blair on a wild goose chase, and ensure that the red herring he was about to plant was shiny enough to distract the bulldog from Strathbane. The orange glow of the dying fire in the old manse's study cast long, dancing shadows against the heavy oak bookshelves, and for a moment the only sound was the soft crackle of Julian Vane's secrets turning to grey ash. Hamish stood with his back to the room, his tall frame silhouetted against the hearth, looking not like a victor, but like a man who had just traded a piece of his sleep for the sake of the village. Elspeth remained near Mary, her hand still resting on the girl's shoulder. She watched Hamish with an expression that was hard to read, a mixture of admiration for his fierce loyalty to Lochdu and a sharp intellectual discomfort with the way he had just incinerated a mountain of legal evidence. "Go on now, Mary," Hamish said, finally turning away from the fireplace. "Take the back path through the woods. Don't go through the village square. If you see any of the blue lights, you just keep walking and don't look back." "Elspeth, will you see her at her door?" Elspeth nodded, her gaze lingering on Hamish for a beat too long. "And what about you, Hamish? Blair isn't going to sit in that hall forever. He'll be looking for someone to blame for the fact that he spent 3 hours in a drafty building without making an arrest." "I have a plan for the DCI," Hamish replied, his hazel eyes glinting with a spark of his usual mischievousness. "He wants a villain in a silk suit. I'm going to give him a phantom to chase all the way back to Strathbane. Now go, before the rain starts up again." Once the room was empty of everyone but himself and Lugs, Hamish took a final look around the study. He needed something, a physical hook to hang Blair's ego on. His eyes landed on a heavy ornate silver lighter sitting on the edge of the desk. It was engraved with the initials J5th, and beneath them a much smaller, crudely scratched set of letters, AS. It was likely an old antique Vane had picked up, but in the hands of a desperate policeman it could be anything. Hamish picked it up with a handkerchief, slipped it into his pocket, and whistled for the dog. The walk back down toward the village was quicker than the ascent. The ha had lifted, and the lights of Lochdu twinkled like fallen stars against the black velvet of the hills. Hamish headed straight for the Lochdu Hotel, knowing that Blair would have moved his temporary headquarters there the moment the parish hall became too cold for his liking. As he entered the lobby, the smell of stale beer and frying fish hit him. The hotel was crowded with the Strathbane team. In the centre of the lounge, DCI Blair was currently haranguing the night porter about the speed of the wireless connection. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed the moment he spotted the red-haired constable. "Where have you been? I told you to stay out of the way, not to vanish off the face of the earth. I've had Anderson searching the gutters for you." "Deepest apologies, sir," Hamish said, adopting his most vacant, humble expression. He pulled a damp notebook from his pocket and flicked through the blank pages. "I was just doing some local work, sir. Thought I'd check the perimeter of the old manse. You know how it is, small-town curiosity and all that." "Legwork? You wouldn't know legwork if it kicked you in the shins," Blair sneered, his face reddening as he stomped toward Hamish. "We've got the preliminary report from the medic. Massive cardiac arrest, just as I said. But there's a complication. Forensic boys found traces of an irritant in the curd. Probably just a cleaning fluid the old biddies used on the bowl, but the super is going to want a full workup because of who Vane was." "An irritant, sir? That's very observant of the boys," Hamish said, widening his eyes in feigned surprise. "Because I found something rather peculiar up at the house. I didn't want to touch it, mind, knowing your strict rules on evidence, but I saw a man lurking in the pines, a tall fellow, very well dressed, not a local. He dropped this near the gate when Lugs barked at him." Hamish carefully produced the silver lighter, holding it out in the handkerchief. Blair's eyes bulged, He snatched the lighter, squinting at the initials. A.S. Who the devil is A.S.? Well, sir, Hamish said, leaning in as if sharing a great secret. I remembered a bit of gossip from the post office. It seems Mr. Vane was involved in a very nasty court case down south last year, something about a business partner named Alistair Sterling. Sterling swore he'd follow Vane to the ends of the earth to get his money back. And there was a silver car, not a Jaguar, mind, but a Mercedes, spotted heading toward the Inverness road just after the meeting started. It was a complete fabrication, woven from a name he'd seen on a piece of junk mail in Vane's hallway and the general knowledge that Blair loved the idea of a metropolitan vendetta. Blair's chest swelled. Alistair Sterling? A business rival? I knew it. I knew this wasn't just a local accident. This is an execution. Macbeth, for once in your miserable life, you've actually been useful. Anderson, get radio to Inverness patrols. I want a silver Mercedes intercepted. Search for anyone matching the description of a well-dressed city type, as the hotel erupted into a fresh frenzy of activity, with detectives scrambling for their car keys and Blair shouting into his phone. Hamish retreated to the corner of the bar. The barman, Rory, slid a glass of whiskey toward him without being asked. You're a wicked man, Hamish Macbeth, Rory whispered, wiping the counter with a dirty rag. Alistair Sterling? I don't suppose such a person even exists? He exists in the mind of DCI Blair, Rory, Hamish said, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the malt, and that's the most important place for him to be tonight. It keeps the spotlights off our neighbours and on the road to Inverness, which is a very long and very empty road this time of year. He looked across the room and saw Elspeth entering the hotel. She looked tired, but she caught his eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Mary was safe. The secret was buried, but as he felt the warmth of the whiskey settle in his chest, Hamish realised the trap he had set wasn't just for Blair. By involving himself in the cover-up, he had tied his own fate to the silence of the village. He watched Blair stomp out of the hotel, dreaming of a promotion and a city arrest, while the real killers were tucked away in their beds, protected by the very man sworn to bring them to justice. The dark humour of the situation wasn't lost on him. Julian Vane had spent his life trying to be the most important man in the room, only to be turned into a footstool for Blair's ambition and a ghost story for the locals. Hamish leaned back, the weight of the day finally catching up to him, knowing that the confrontation wasn't over. He still had to manage the fallout when the silver Mercedes failed to materialize, and he had to live with the look in Elspeth's eyes, a look that suggested she knew exactly what kind of man he had become to keep his Highland peace. The morning light that filtered through the windows of the Lochdu Hotel was as cold and grey as a wet slate, doing little to improve the mood of DCI Blair. The Alistair Sterling lead had, predictably, curdled over the course of the night. The silver Mercedes intercepted near Inverness had turned out to belong to a very confused and very influential retired judge, who was now threatening to have Blair's badge for breakfast. Hamish sat in a corner of the hotel lounge, carefully buttering a piece of toast, while Luggs rested his chin on his knee, his soulful eyes tracking every movement of the knife. Across the room, Blair was a picture of oscillating fury and panic, his face a shade of mottled plum that suggested his blood pressure was currently off the charts. "Nothing," Blair roared, slamming a folder onto the coffee table. "No Alistair Sterling on the witness list. No silver car in the village CCTV, and no sign of this well-dressed phantom you claim to see in the pines, Macbeth. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were hallucinating from too much illegal salmon. Or worse, you're playing me for a fool." Hamish chewed his toast slowly, his expression one of wounded innocence. "Now, sir, the Highlands are a tricky place for the eyes. Mist can play games with a man's perspective. But that lighter was real enough, wasn't it? It has the initials. Perhaps the fellow just doubled back. There are plenty of forestry tracks a man could hide a car in if he knew the terrain. He doesn't know the terrain. He's a city hitman. Blair barked. Though his voice lacked its earlier conviction, he was starting to realize that the high-profile arrest he had envisioned was dissolving into a bureaucratic nightmare. The forensics team is breathing down my neck. They found the digitalis in the curd, Macbeth. It's a pharmaceutical grade, or at least a very concentrated extract. The super is calling it a premeditated poisoning. If I don't produce a suspect by noon, the press is going to have a field day with the lemon curd killer. Hamish set his toast down. This was the dangerous part of dancing. If Blair felt backed into a corner, he would stop looking for phantoms and start looking at the people Hamish was trying to protect. He had to pivot the blame, but he had to do it in a way that didn't lead back to the parish hall or the old manse. He looked out the window and saw Archie McLean walking toward the grocery store, his shoulders hunched. The village was still on edge, and the red herring needed a more substantial body than a name on a lighter. "You know, sir," Hamish said, lowering his voice as if wary of eavesdroppers, "there is one person who's been acting very strangely since the body was found. Not a city type, mind you, but someone who had more to gain from Mr. Vane's silence than anyone else. A man who was seen argued with Vane just yesterday about a certain financial discrepancy." Blair's eyes narrowed, the predator in him sensing a new scent. "Who? Don't play games with me, Macbeth." "Arthur Sowerby," Hamish lied, pulling the name from the AS scratched into the lighter. He had remembered an old, disgruntled landscape gardener who had done some work for Vane months ago and left in a towering rage over a bounced cheque. Sowerby had moved to the islands weeks ago, well out of reach of a quick arrest, but his name on a police file would provide the perfect stalling tactic. He was the one Vane hired to do the gardens at the manse. Vane accused him of stealing tools, and Sowerby promised he'd get his own back. He has a sister in Strathbane who works in a chemist's shop. Plenty of access to digitalis, I'd wager. Blair's face transformed. The hope of a local grudge with a chemical twist was far more palatable than a total lack of leads. Sowerby. Why wasn't he on the initial list of residents? "He moved away recently, sir. I only just remembered the connection. He's a bitter sort of man. Fits the profile of a quiet poisoner, wouldn't you say? Not like a flashy hitman, but someone who knows how to wait." "Anderson!" Blair screamed, not bothering to answer Hamish. "Get on the computer. Find me an Arthur Sowerby. Check his connections to chemists in Strathbane. I want his last known address and a warrant for his arrest." As Blair and his team vanished into the back room to chase this new, slightly more grounded phantom, Hamish felt a familiar weight in his stomach. He had successfully diverted the storm again, but the lie was growing limbs. He slipped out of the hotel, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. He needed to talk to Elspeth. He found her Land Rover parked near the harbour, where she was watching the local fishermen haul in their nets. "You've done it again, haven't you?" she asked without turning as he approached. "You've given him a new bone to chew on." "It's a temporary bone, Elspeth," Hamish said, leaning against the salt-crusted railing. "Sowerby is in Harris. By the time Blair realises he's not our man, the heat will have died down. But I'm worried about the minister. He's not a man built for keeping secrets. He looks like he's ready to confess to the nearest cat." "He won't confess if he thinks it will hurt Mary," Elspeth replied, her voice firm. "But Hamish, you can't keep inventing suspects. Eventually, Blair is going to realise that the only person who knows everything about everyone in this village is you. You're the smartest man in Loch Dhu, and that makes you the most dangerous." "I'm just a lazy copper who wants to keep his stove warm," Hamish muttered, but he knew she was right. The trap he had set was closing, but he had to make sure he wasn't the one caught in the jaws. He saw the minister crossing the square, heading toward the parish hall with a bucket of cleaning supplies. Mr. Wellington looked like a man walking to his own execution. Hamish realized that the real danger wasn't Blair's incompetence, it was the village's conscience. If he didn't find a way to solve the case in a way that satisfied the law without destroying the innocent, the truth would eventually leak out like the water from a cracked dam. He had to set a final, definitive trap, not for a killer, but for the truth itself. He had to make Julian Vine's death look so much like an accident that even the forensic labs in Strathbane would have to agree. "I need to go to the hall," Hamish said. "I need to see the kettle and the tea again. There's something I missed, something that doesn't involve jam or gardeners. If I can prove Vane was responsible for his own end, Blair will have to drop the murder charge." "And was he?" Elspeth asked, her eyes searching for him. "In a way," Hamish said softly. "He was the one who brought the poison into the house, even if he didn't know it. He just didn't realise that in Loch Dhu, even the flowers have teeth." He turned and headed toward the hall, his mind racing. He had to plant the final clue, the one that would turn a murder into a tragic self-inflicted mistake, and he had to do it before Blair came back with a pair of handcuffs for a man on an island 3 hours away. The parish hall sat in the gathering gloom like a weary beast, its stone walls still holding the chill of the previous night's tragedy. Hamish pushed open the side door, the one leading directly into the kitchen annex, and felt the heavy, silent presence of the room close in around him. Luggs sniffed the floorboards tentatively, his tail tucked between his legs. The yellow police tape across the main doorway fluttered in the draught, a gaudy reminder of DCI Blair's intrusion. Hamish did not turn on overhead lights. Instead, he used a small pocket torch, its beam cutting through the shadows to settle on the empty pine table where Julian Vane had met his undignified end. The electric kettle was still there, sitting on its base like a cold, hollow shell. Hamish moved toward it, his mind retracing the steps of the previous afternoon. He knew that if he was to save Mary and the minister, he had to provide a narrative that the forensics team could verify, a truth that was technically accurate but morally distorted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried sprig of a plant he had gathered from the overgrown conservatory at the old manse before he had left. It was foxglove, the beautiful bell-shaped harbinger of digitalis. But this particular piece had been crushed and dried, the sort of thing a man like Vane might keep in a collection of Highland botanicals for his pretentious study. He carefully placed the dried bits of the plant near the base of the kettle, as if they had fallen from a pocket or been used by an amateur to brew a traditional herbal tea. Then he looked at the cupboard where the village supplies were kept. There was a tin of herbal infusions, the kind of trendy organic stuff Vane had insisted on bringing to the meeting to replace the vulgar breakfast tea. Hamish opened the tin. Inside were various satchels of dried leaves. With the precision of a man threading a needle, he took a pinch of the foxglove debris and worked it into one of the open satchels. "It wasn't a murder, Luggs," Hamish whispered, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "It was an experiment. Mr. Vane, in his infinite wisdom and arrogance, thought he knew more about our hills than we did. He thought he'd brew himself a bit of Highland vitality using the plants from his own garden, not realizing that the dose makes the poison. It was a plausible lie." Vane was exactly the kind of man who would read a book on Victorian folk medicine and decide he was an expert. If the digitalis was found in his own tea tin, and traces of the plant were found in his coat pockets, which Hamish would ensure happened shortly, Blair's case for a coordinated village conspiracy would collapse. It would become a case of death by misadventure, fueled by the victim's own vanity. Just as he was finishing his grim stagecraft, the heavy front doors of the hall groaned open. The sound of boots on hollow floorboards alerted him that he wasn't alone. He clicked off his torch and flattened himself against the shadows of the pantry, his hand resting on Lug's collar to keep the dog silent. "I know you're in here, Hamish," a voice called out. It wasn't Blair's bark. It was the soft, trembling tone of the Reverend Mr. Wellington. Hamish stepped out of the shadows, his face unreadable. The minister was standing by the trestle tables, his eyes red-rimmed and his clerical collar undone. He looked like a man who had reached the end of his tether. "I can't do it," Wellington said, his voice cracking. "I went to the hotel to see Blair. I was going to tell him everything, about money, about Curd, about silence. I can't let that girl carry this, Hamish. It's a stain on the parish that even the rain won't wash away." "And what good would that do, Minister?" Hamish asked, walking toward him with a slow, deliberate pace. "You'd go to jail, Mary would go to a young offenders institution, and the church would be boarded up. Who does that serve? Certainly not Julian Vane, who's already past caring, and certainly not the people of Lochdu who need you. But the truth is a complicated thing in the Highlands," Hamish interrupted, standing close enough to see the sweat on the older man's brow. "The truth is that Julian Vane was a man who poisoned the air he breathed long before he touched that curd. Now, listen to me. I've found something. It seems Mr. Vane had a habit of collecting dried herbs from the manse garden. The postmistress saw him yesterday morning with a pocketful of foxglove. He thought it was a heart tonic. He must have mixed it into his own tea tin by mistake." Wellington stared at him, his mouth hanging slightly open. "By mistake? But, Hamish, we know what we need to know to sleep at night," Hamish said firmly. "Blair is coming back here in 10 minutes. I told him I'd found a new piece of evidence that would clear the Sowerby lead. When he arrives, you are going to be here, and you are going to tell him that you saw Mr. Vane fussing with his own tea tin before the meeting started. You're going to tell him Vane complained of a fluttering heart and said he had his own special remedy." "You're asking me to bear false witness," Wellington whispered, horrified. "I'm asking you to save a life," Hamish countered. "The law is a blunt instrument, Minister. It doesn't care about mercy or context. It just wants a body and a name. I'm giving it Vane's own name. It's the only way this ends without more blood on the floor. The sound of a car engine, the unmistakable, aggressive roar of Blair's police vehicle, approached the hall. Headlights swept across the tall windows, casting long skeletal shadows against the walls. Wellington looked at the door, then back at Hamish. The struggle in his eyes was palpable, a war between a lifetime of piety and a sudden, desperate need for survival. "He's here," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a command. "Be a man of your people, Minister, not just a man of the book." The doors burst open and DCI Blair stormed in, his face a mask of triumph that quickly soured when he saw the two men standing in the dim hall. "What is this, a prayer meeting? I told you to stay, Macbeth. And you, Minister, don't you have a sermon to write?" "We've found the source, sir," Hamish said, stepping forward and guiding Blair toward the kitchen with an air of professional urgency. "It wasn't a gardener or a hitman. It was right under our noses. It seems Mr. Vane was his own worst enemy." As Blair leaned over the kettle, his eyes widening as he spotted the evidence Hamish had planted, Hamish felt a cold shiver go down his spine. The trap was set, and the bait was a lie that felt as heavy as a mountain. He watched the minister take a deep breath and begin to speak, the first words of the deception falling from his lips with a practiced hollow resonance. The confrontation was coming to an end, but as Hamish caught his own reflection in the darkened window, he realized the man looking back at him was no longer just a lazy village policeman. He was the keeper of Lochdu's darkest secret, and the price of that silence was a piece of himself he might never get back. DCI Blair stood over the kitchen table, his face just inches from the dried foxglove sprigs that Hamish had so carefully arranged. The harsh beam of Blair's own heavy-duty flashlight made the green debris look sinister, like tiny, desiccated claws reaching up from the pine surface. The room felt smaller with the inspector's presence, the air vibrating with his frantic, misplaced energy. He looked from the kettle to the tin of herbal tea, then back to the Reverend Mr. Wellington, who stood near the pantry, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were white. The silence in the room was brittle, a thin sheet of ice that Hamish was determined to walk upon with the deceptive lightness of a mountain cat. "You're telling me," Blair began, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble that usually preceded a volcanic eruption, "that this man, this Julian Vane, was a closet herbalist? That he was out there picking weeds like a deranged botanist and brewing them in a public hall? It sounds like a load of Highland cobblers, Macbeth. It sounds like something you've cooked up to get me out of your hair so you can go back to your poaching." "I can only tell you what the evidence suggests, sir," Hamish replied, his voice a masterpiece of humble, plodding sincerity. He gestured vaguely toward the tea tin. "Mr. Wellington here was just telling me about the conversation he had with the deceased. It seems Mr. Vane was quite the enthusiast for natural remedies, though the local flora had properties that London doctors couldn't match. He was a man of great ego, sir. He believed he could master anything, even the chemistry of the hills. Blair turned his bulging eyes toward the minister. Well, minister, speak up. I haven't been all night. Is this true? Did you see him with this poison? Mr. Wellington took a shaky breath. For a heartbeat, Hamish feared the old man's conscience would snap, spilling the truth of the lemon curd and the blackmail into the dirty linoleum. But when the minister spoke, his voice was surprisingly steady, carrying the weight of decades spent delivering sermons to a sceptical congregation. It is as P.C. Macbeth says, Inspector. Mr. Vane was boastful. He showed me a collection of dried herbs in his study only 2 days ago. He called them his Highland hearties. He mentioned he intended to brew a pot during the committee meeting to stay sharp. I warned him that some plants are not meant for the pot, but he merely laughed. He called us quaintly superstitious for fearing the land we live on. Blair snatched the tea tin, shaking it near his ear. He looked at the labels, the organic branding, and the pinch of dried foxglove that Hamish had worked into the leaves. He was a fool, Blair muttered, the anger in his voice shifting from Hamish to the victim. A metropolitan idiot playing at being a crofter. He probably thought it was a health kick. If the forensics lab confirms this is the same digitalis that was in the curd, it's a self-inflicted fatality, accidental poisoning due to gross negligence. It would seem so, sir, Hamish said, looking down at his boots to hide the flicker of triumph in his eyes. A tragic case of a man's vanity being his undoing, though I suppose it's a better headline for the Strathbane papers than a murder with no suspect. The self-made victim, they might call it. Blair's red face softened slightly at the mention of the papers. He was already seeing the press conference, the way he would describe his meticulous examination of the kitchen, and his shrewd questioning of the local clergy. He would be the hero who saw through the confusion to find the truth of the victim's secret hobby. Right, Blair barked, slamming the tin back onto the table. Anderson, get the bags. I want every leaf in this room documented. And get a team up to the manse to search his study for more of this herbal rubbish. If we find his source, we close the book on Julian Vane by sunrise, as the Strathbane detectives swarmed into the annex, pushing past Hamish with their usual lack of grace. Hamish caught the minister's eye. Mr. Wellington looked aged, his spirit hollowed out by the lie, but there was a profound sense of relief in the way his shoulders finally slumped. The shadow of the jail had lifted from the parish, replaced by a different kind of darkness, the kind that stayed in the corners of a man's mind. "I'll see you to the manse, minister," Hamish said softly, guiding the older man toward the hall's main doors. They stepped out into the night. The rain had cleared entirely, and the stars were sharp and cold above the black silhouette of the mountains. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of salt from the loch and the clean, honest smell of the Highlands. Behind them, the blue lights of the police cars were still flashing, but they felt distant now, a circus that had finally run its course. "He believed it, Hamish," Wellington whispered as they reached the edge of the churchyard. "He actually believed it. Does that make the lie any less of a sin?" "In Loch Dhu, minister, we have a saying," Hamish replied, his voice returning to its gentle rhythmic lilt. "Sometimes you have to burn the gorse to let the new grass grow. Vane was a fire that would have consumed us all. Now he's just a cautionary tale for the tourists. You go and get some sleep. And Mary too. The morning will be quiet again, I promise you that." As the minister disappeared into the shadows of the rectory, Hamish stood for a long moment in the silence. He could hear the distant murmur of the river where he had lost his salmon earlier that day. It felt like a lifetime ago. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold silver lighter he had used to bait Blair's vanity. He walked to the edge of the pier, looked around to ensure no detectives were lurking, and let the small metal object slip from his fingers into the deep dark waters of the loch. The case was closed. Blair would take the credit, the village would keep its secrets, and Julian Vane would be forgotten before the first snow fell. But as Hamish turned to walk back toward his small lonely police station, Lugs trotting faithfully at his side, He knew that the piece of Lochdu had been bought at a price. He was the only one who knew the full lemon curd recipe. As he looked up at the moon, he wondered if the lazy policeman of the Highlands would ever truly find rest again in a village where even the jam was a matter of life and death. He had set the final trap, and the truth was now buried so deep that not even the strongest Highland wind could stir it. The following week in Lochdur arrived with a biting frost that turned the puddles into jagged mirrors and sent the last of the autumn leaves scurrying like mice into the gutters. The circus of sirens and flashing lights had retreated back across the Sutherland hills to Strathbane, leaving behind only the cold, grey silence of a village that had survived a storm. DCI Blair's final report had been a masterpiece of self-congratulatory prose, detailing how his swift and decisive forensic analysis had uncovered the tragic, self-inflicted poisoning of Julian Vane. The newspapers had carried the story for exactly 2 days, painting a picture of a wealthy, eccentric Englishman who had played a fatal game with Highland botany. It was a neat conclusion that satisfied everyone, especially the super, who loathed unsolved murders, and the villagers, who loathed Julian Vane. Hamish Macbeth sat at his kitchen table in the small whitewashed police station, the air thick with the comforting domestic scent of a peat fire and boiling coffee. Lugs were sprawled across the rug, his paws twitching in a dream that likely involved the pursuit of a celestial rabbit. Hamish was currently engaged in the only kind of paperwork he truly tolerated, a letter to the department in Strathbane written in a cramped, laborious hand, explaining why he was far too busy with the sudden increase in local traffic violations to be considered for the vacant sergeant's position in the city. He signed it with a flourish of feigned incompetence and tucked it into an envelope, feeling the weight of the promotion threat lift like a morning mist. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Hamish didn't need to check the window to know it was Elspeth Grant. He could tell by the steady, purposeful rhythm of the rap. He opened the door to find her standing there, a thermos in one hand and a small brown paper bag in the other. Her face was pink from the cold, and her eyes held a look of quiet understanding that made Hamish feel both seen and slightly exposed. "I thought you might be in need of a proper breakfast, Hamish," she said, stepping into the warmth of the station without waiting for an invitation. "The hotel is still serving those greasy kippers, and I know you've been neglecting your own larder while you were playing stage manager for the DCI. Hamish pulled out a chair for her, his movements slow and easy. "Stage manager? Now, Elspeth, that's a very dramatic word for a man who was just following the evidence. Blair found what he found. I was merely the one who held the torch so he wouldn't trip over his own feet." Elspeth set the paper bag on the table. Inside was a fresh loaf of soda bread and a small unlabeled jar of honey. Not jam, Hamish noted with a grim inward smile, but pure golden honey. "The minister came to see me yesterday," she said, her voice dropping to a cautious level. "He started the repairs on the church roof. He told me he received an anonymous donation that was exactly the amount needed for the lead work. He seemed different, lighter in a way, but with a shadow in his eyes that I don't think will ever quite go away." Hamish said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Conscience is a heavy guest to house, but the roof is being fixed and Mary is back at her mother's house. She's helping Mrs. Kennedy with the winter baking, I hear. They're sticking to plain sponge cakes this year, no lemon curd." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the soft hiss of the peat. The secret of Julian Vane's death was now a part of the foundations of Lochdu, a dark thread woven into the tapestry of the village. It was the price of peace, a bargain struck in a kitchen annex and sealed with a lie. Hamish knew that some might call it an injustice, but as he looked out the window at the peaceful, frost-covered square, he knew that the law Blair practiced was a cold thing that rarely accounted for the warmth of human survival. "You're staying, then?" Elspeth asked, her eyes searching for him. "Blair told the hotel barman that you were a useless peasant who would be lucky to keep your post after the mess you made of the initial crime scene. I think he's trying to have you sidelined permanently. Hamish let out a short, dry chuckle. Being sidelined is exactly what I've been working toward for 10 years, Elspeth. If Blair thinks I'm a peasant, he'll leave me alone to rot in the Highlands, and rotting in Loch Duagh is a far better life than thriving in a city. I've got the loch, I've got the hills, and I've got enough gossip to keep me entertained until I'm as old as Archie MacLean. And you have your secrets, Elspeth added softly. Everyone in the Highlands has those, Hamish replied. He stood up and walked to the window. The sun was beginning to break through the grey clouds, casting a pale golden light over the water. He saw the postmistress opening her shop, and the curry shop owner shaking out a rug. The rhythm of the village was returning to its slow, predictable beat. The boor was gone, the outsider had been expelled, and the village had closed ranks once again. Hamish felt a sudden sharp pang of hunger, not for justice, but for the simple, uncomplicated life he had fought so hard to protect. He eyed the soda bread on the table and the coffee in his hand. He had manipulated the law, deceived his superiors, and burned evidence in a fireplace, all to ensure that a girl could go home to her mother and a minister could keep his church. He wasn't sure if he was a good policeman, but as he watched lugs yawn and stretch by the fire, he knew he was a Highland one. "Well," Hamish said, turning back to Elspeth with a genuine smile, "I think it's a fine day for a walk. I heard there's a stag up on the ridge that's been bothering the sheep. I suppose I should go and have a word with it, purely in a professional capacity, of course." Elspeth laughed, a warm sound filling the small room. "Of course, Hamish, just make sure you don't bring it back in a bowl of lemon curd." As they stepped out into the crisp morning air, Hamish Macbeth felt the familiar, comforting weight of his uniform. The mystery of the parish hall was over, the trap had been sprung, and the Highlands had reclaimed their own. He was back to being the lazy, red-haired constable of Loch Duagh, a man who saw everything and said nothing, happy to stay exactly where he was, in the heart of a village that knew how to keep a secret just as well as he did. The sun finally managed to burn through the stubborn Highland mist, turning the surface of the loch into a sheet of hammered silver. Hamish watched Elspeth's Land Rover disappear around the bend of the coastal road, the sound of its engine fading into the natural symphony of crying gulls and the rhythmic lap of water against the pier. He remained on the doorstep of the police station for a long moment, filling his lungs with air that no longer tasted of copper, rain, or the cloying, synthetic sweetness of Julian Vane's presence. The village felt lighter, as if a heavy, ill-fitting cloak had been lifted from its shoulders. He turned back inside and moved toward the stove. The peat had burned down to a glowing orange heart, and the kettle was beginning to sing a low domestic tune. Hamish reached into the larder and pulled out a small, humble tin of basic black tea, none of the organic, high-altitude fancies that had been the undoing of the late Julian Vane. As he scooped the leaves into the pot, his mind drifted one last time to the ledger he had burned. He thought of the names, the dates, and the desperate little numbers that had driven a quiet girl to gather poison and a man of God to watch a murder. He knew that some would argue the scales of justice had been left unbalanced. Vane was dead, yet his killers were at home, and his judge was a man who spent his mornings dodging phone calls from headquarters. But Hamish, pouring boiling water into a pot, felt no such conflict. In the Highlands, justice wasn't always a matter of a courtroom and a gavel. Sometimes it was a matter of equilibrium. Vane had brought a foreign, predatory coldness to Loch Duagh, and the village had simply neutralized the threat with its own ancient, quiet weapons. A sudden, sharp rapping at the window made him jump. It was Archie MacLean, his face beaming and his accordion case strapped firmly to his back. He pointed toward the parish hall and made a series of frantic, celebratory gestures. The winter fair was back on track. Without Vane's black tie gala to worry about, the village had reverted to its traditional plan: a mountain of Mrs. Kennedy's jam, a lot of very loud music, and enough whiskey to make the long winter nights bearable. "I'll be there, Archie," Hamish shouted through the glass, waving him away with a grin. He sat down at his kitchen table, the soda bread Elspeth had brought still warm and fragrant. Lugs, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, trotted over and rested his chin on Hamish's knee, his tail giving a single hopeful thump against the floorboards. Hamish broke off a piece of the bread, spread it thick with the golden honey and shared it with the dog. As he ate, he picked up the local newspaper that had been tossed onto his mat earlier that morning. On the third page, there was a small, blurry photograph of DCI Blair shaking hands with a local councillor in Strathbane. The headline read, "Strathbane Police Close Case on Vane Tragedy. Blair praises superior investigative techniques." Hamish chuckled, a soft, dry sound that didn't disturb the peace of the room. Blair had his headline, Mary had her freedom, and the church had its roof. Most importantly, the authorities in Strathbane now officially regarded PC Hamish Macbeth as a man who couldn't find a clue if it were tied to his shoelaces. He was safe. The promotion was a dead letter, the transfer was a forgotten threat, and the city was a million miles away. He finished his tea and stood up, moving to the fireplace to give the peat a final poke. The station was warm, the larder was reasonably full, and there was no silver Jaguar in sight. He looked at the rod leaning against the wall near the door. The salmon would be back in the river today, and with Blair gone, the banks would be quiet. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, reaching for his old battered cap and settling it onto his red hair. "I think the peace of Loch Dhu has been restored, and I think we've earned ourselves a very long, very lazy afternoon by the water. Professional duties, you understand. We wouldn't want anyone else trying to poach that silver fellow under the bridge." He stepped out into the crisp, sun-drenched afternoon, locking the station door behind him. He didn't look like a man who had outsmarted a detective chief inspector or buried a murder. He looked like exactly what he wanted to be, a shiftless, unassuming village bobby, with nowhere to be and nothing to do. As he began the slow walk toward the river, whistling a low, rambling tune, the village of Loch Dhu settled back into its timeless, secret-laden routine. The mystery was gone, the secrets were safe, and Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he belonged,